All right, so we're all now well aware that another 737 has crashed. It was in China, and it doesn't seem to be any kind of MAX-related kind of issues that we talked about, so many times on the show, but it's an unfortunate thing, and I know the elephant in the room, at least first thing everybody's probably thinking when something like this happens in a place like that, and I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say it, but probably will anyway. You just have this vision of a flight crew with maybe 800 hours between the two of them flying a 737, and that's just scary in so many different ways. We feel lucky that in the United States, we don't really have situations like that. Even at the regionals, I mean, a flight crew's probably got at least a couple thousand hours combined. At least I should hope. Anyway, if you're on a mainline carrier, there's probably at least 10,000 hours plus between the two people up front and probably a fair amount of gray hair up there too. Go America. In other countries, though, we know it's not the same. And overall, I mean, they tend to do a decent job. And maybe that has something to do with the fact that a lot of their pilots probably actually trained in the U.S. But no matter what happened, I just can't help but think that a lack of experience sometimes just introduces too much risk into situations where it shouldn't be. Anyway, when it comes to pilot training in the U.S., there are several paths. Obviously the military, obviously the civilian route of sort of paying your way. There's the collegiate way of doing it, which of course is civilian, but there's creative ways too. But those are the main ways that you can do it. And I think that the main difference for those in the civilian route is that those who went that way had to spend so much time being a flight instructor, which sort of gave them an opportunity to see a lot of stuff. But what if we just train somebody from the ground up, like from day one, where all there is to do is become an airline pilot? Like for someone who is selected to a program that's handpicked, and all they've ever done is train for this. There's been 100 stage checks along the way, and by the end, they got to be pretty good, right? Anyway, can that level of grooming make up for a lack of overall experience in terms of time? Well, my gut feeling is generally no, you can't. But what it can do is give you a really good leg up. And that's what ab initio programs do, which I guess sort of brings us to the original point where, other countries have to do things differently, and ab initio programs are a big part of it. But can or even should we do the same thing in the U.S.? I mean, honestly, I kind of like the idea, as long as it's done right, that is. And, I'm hoping that that's what one major airline and one major general aviation manufacturer are working on doing together right now. And if you want to hear more about that, well, then don't go away. Thanks for sticking around. This is Podcasting on a Plane. I'm Brandon Gonzalez, your traffic controller, pilot, flight instructor, and double plane crash survivor. And now, the host of this show, and you're with me here in the West Coast Delta, where we share stories of the air world. And today I have something that sounds like a business deal, but maybe it's a little bit more. And like I said, one major airline, it's United, and one major manufacturer, Cirrus, have teamed up to give students at United Aviate Academy the best start they feel they can. And David Moser from Cirrus is here to tell us all about it. Now, a little bit of an apology. The interview with David is awesome, but what I wanted to do was include an interview from the head of United's Aviate Academy and then the person at United who's in charge of overseeing that whole project to complete the story. And unfortunately, that kind of got held up in PR. Nonetheless, though, I think you're really going to like what David has to say, and I know you're going to learn a few things about the Cirrus. I know I certainly did. And the best part of the rest of the show is that it's all about you and the plethora of wonderful feedback that I've had since the show came back on the air. And let's start with people who actually support the thing. Lisa, thank you. She bought me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com. And so did Jeffrey Niemeyer. He generously bought me some coffees there too. Thank you, sir. And he also wrote, I really appreciate the show, and I like how you're willing to talk about some of the more emotionally heavy subjects, such as in your most recent episode and episode 92, etc. Also, I'm very glad to hear that you're okay after experiencing that accident. But on a much lighter note, I loved Concorde Week. Spy Week was excellent too, and I've actually visited the Kalamazoo Air Zoo multiple times as I live just north in Grand Rapids. It's always an incredible thing seeing that SR-71B, and if you ever find yourself in West Michigan again, give me a shout. Maybe we can grab a drink. Well, Jeffrey, I absolutely will do that. I hope to go back there someday soon. I've never in my life felt so excited to go back to a museum, but that place, it really is just on another level. I don't even think of it as a museum, really. It's something else. But yeah, if I'm ever out there, I'll definitely give you a call. So for those of you who listen to APG, and I know that's where a lot of you came from originally about 5 years ago when we started doing this thing, at the end of each episode, you hear from Hillel, and he followed me on Strava. And for those of you who are athletes, it's a really fun way to keep up together, whether you're a triathlete, swimmer, cyclist, runner, or whatever. Pretty much any endurance stuff, Strava's got something for you. So I, of course, followed him back. And a couple other listeners have done that too. And it'd be really cool if you did the same. We can all keep up with each other's exploits and kind of keep each other going. Sometimes it gets a little hard, but it's always nice to have somebody giving you kudos. Now, Russ Irwin, he sent me a bunch of stuff, and you've heard from him on the show before. But he says, Brandon, I liked listening to the Language podcast today. You're a sensitive guy, and that's always come through in your messages. Thanks, I guess. You and Rob touched on enough topics to fill a book, so I want to respond to two things. Number one, you're both trying to sort of dodge politics, but what was clear was that the political landscape of the last 1 to 2 years has created a lot of stress for both of you. And I think much more than the pandemic, which was ostensibly the source of the stress you're talking about. As they say, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. By the way, I'm using that again. That is one of the best quotes I've heard in a long time. Keep in mind that 50 years ago, the National Guard was shooting unarmed students at campuses. Hundreds of thousands were marching in the streets. The young were being forced to fight and die for something they didn't believe in. And the nation was bitterly split by Vietnam, long hair, rock and roll, and a host of quote-unquote culture wars issues. We've been here before. But what we've not felt so strongly before is that the foundations of democracy are threatened. Legitimacy, fairness, representation, etc. Irrespective of where we fall on the political spectrum, that seems to be the issue that's exacerbating the divide for everyone. And that's worthy of some stress. You know, that is really one of the most well thought out points, by the way, Russ, that I've heard in a long time. And I think you hit the nail right on the head. And his point number two is that I did a lot of flying in the last 2 years, and I found that flying relieved stress if the stress was not flying related. If the stress is flying related, like schedule, weather, difficult airport, etc., then it must be heeded, respected, and factored into the decision of whether or not to go fly. After that, the die is cast to a large degree, and few pilots are willing to turn back and divert, etc. But, like the hours I spent sailing before flying, external stresses not related to the trip can be and are set aside because I needed to fully concentrate on the boat or the plane. It's not so much of an escape as a commitment to the task at hand and safely completing the trip. Committing my full attention to flying simply doesn't leave room to think about some unrelated issue that was concerning on me before I began taxiing. Returning to those other stresses after the flight, I often have a new perspective because of the quote-unquote time off taken during the flight. Great to have you back, Russ. All right, there's a lot there, and you know what, I really like all this stuff he said because, again, I had a student once that, I remember he said something about, yeah, when I'm flying, I'm just calm and, you know, nothing bothers me and all that. And I kind of thought, you know, that cool, I guess, but it also seemed a little bit weird that somebody could be, I don't know, there's a headspace you're in when you're flying right, and it's a flow state, of course. I mean, we all know that. That's really what you're looking for. But like Russ is saying here, you leave your stuff, or you try your best at least to leave your stuff behind you on the ground because it doesn't belong in the air. And when you're in the air, you're not just sort of Zen-like necessarily. Flow, I guess maybe you could say is Zen-like, but I'm not sure if it's in the peaceful way, but flow is an interesting thing. But exactly, once you're doing it, it requires basically all of you. Even those long sort of hours where you're sitting there on autopilot over Kansas, I mean, you're still to a degree, you're engaged. You're there. You're flying a plane. You got the controls in front of you. So that's right. There's not enough bandwidth to be messing around with other stuff. But I think the thing we were kind of getting at too was that stress, particularly as he stated in point number one about the fact that, you know, your feelings of democracy are threatened. You're something deeper than we felt before. You know, your safety, whether it was the virus, your feelings of democracy, whether it's been how things were handled, whatever. It's kind of gotten there really deep. And yes, it has happened before, but there's something that happens to you where it's just hard to concentrate anymore. And once you're in air world, yeah, it's all behind you, it's on the ground, but there's still something like when you just weren't ready to be there in the first place. And then you're right, you have to factor that in. And should you be there at all? And if the answer is no, well, then of course you don't go. He emailed me a few days later, actually, with a few more thoughts on flying and politics. And he said, I'm a pretty politically aware and active person, and politics are always on my mind. And one of the things I've always enjoyed about flying is that when I arrive at a new airport, I'm a pilot with a plane and not a member of a political tribe. And that's obviously the case with ATC and controllers, and also maybe the case at airports with line crews, FBOs, A&Ps, etc. They're all pretty apolitical. Flying might just be a good way to escape the stress of the politics, which kept popping up in that podcast. Talking to pilots about the planes can be a bridge between the tribes. And of course I responded, you know what, I agree, until the topic of fuel prices comes out. Anyway, that was probably a terrible joke. But yeah, it's nice to operate in what's basically a politically neutral environment. You know, anytime there's common ground we can all agree on makes things far more enjoyable. And what better topic than aviation and airplanes, right? Anyway, Russ, I really appreciate that feedback. Very, very good stuff in there. I think you've made a lot of points that, really break it down to their most important parts. And then, if anybody else is struggling with that for a while, then I think you probably summed up what they were trying to say really nicely, and I appreciate it. Got some stuff here from Brooks Doro. He flies from a neighboring airport here by the Delta, and he said, I enjoyed your latest podcast update. I had no idea of your semi-recent experience, so glad you walked away. And listened last night to your podcast. It's all about risk management and being prepared for the worst. And it's a balance between fear and what might happen and the total joy of flying and all that it encompasses. Always in the back of my mind of what quote-unquote could happen. I'm always thinking about, the engine out and where would I land, that type scenario during flight, but not to the extent of fearing the experience. Again, it's a manageable balance. So thank you for sharing your experience and thoughts. And I hope to catch you in person again or on the air when doing practice approaches. Keep up the good work. And what's funny is he actually did catch me. I was working and he came in on practice approach, full stop, parked at transient, picked up a buddy and took off. Didn't get to see him in person, but it was nice to see him walking across the ramp. Now I know what you look like, Brooks. I'm just kidding. Former guest and friend of the show, Daniel Sternberg, he says, woohoo, I can't wait to listen to the new episode. Unfortunately, no flights out of the Delta in the near future. Our plane goes in for its annual on Friday, and we're having some features added, so it'll be down for 3 weeks. Being grounded won't be fun, but it's a shorter downtime than originally inspected because they didn't get the parts for the satellite Wi-Fi in yet, so we'll have to wait for that, but at least we can get the plane back a little bit sooner. Here's hoping the return gains momentum, and I've been missing your voice, and more importantly, your insights. Best, Daniel. Well, yep, it is great to be back, and thank you for the email, and I hope that one of your first flights, when you do get it back, is down to the Delta. I'm not going to say what your new airplane is, but let's just say that the last one was a Phenom 300, and this one's an upgrade, so congratulations. And friend of this podcast and so many podcasts, Glenn Towler from Down Under, he says, welcome back. It seems like our mutual friend Rob Mark is everywhere when it comes to podcasting. You know what, Glenn, you're right about that. He doesn't like to go steady, that's for sure. My friend Kyle, he wrote in actually quite a bit of stuff. I'm going to read most of it here, but he actually may be someone we have on the show later on to talk about some of this stuff. But he also became a very generous Patreon supporter. So Kyle, thank you for this and for that. We had a couple emails back and forth, and I'll start where he says, thanks. Well, he's a name here, but the former chief pilot of the flight school we both worked at, and I had an engine failure in the Mooney, midfield on a soft field takeoff at the Delta. We stopped with about 100 feet left, 100% clogged fuel filter and the bypass. I've also had an engine fire on the E-175. 2.5 months later, had another engine failure. But something you said resonated with me. When I was in Alaska, we had 2 fatal accidents. The first one was painful. I knew the pilot fairly well. I had to go fly home on a Caravan the next morning. Second one, I was home. It hit very close to home, too. And I also knew the pilot. I called, well, I won't say his name, but a former friend of ours, and canceled my future flights in the Seminole. Even called another friend of ours and told him I wanted to quit aviation. I couldn't handle the back-to-back fatals, 5 months apart. And one of those guys, he did what your friend did. He said, we're getting you back up in the air tomorrow. He took the day off from his day job, and we went flying. And since then, when I find out about a fatal accident of someone I knew or something major happens to me, I don't resort to alcohol or any of the bad things. I've learned how and what really to expect. I took a union course about 5 years ago called CIRP, Critical Incident Response Program, and it's to provide peer-to-peer counseling after any critical event. Understanding what was quote-unquote normal, like the flashbacks, nightmares, irritability, etc. I'm sure NATCA participates in it as well. Quick side note, yes, I did actually give that a call. And it's a globally recognized program, and if you're having trouble, it's the best training I've ever had, hands down. He said a friend of his geared up at Dash 8 in Newark quite a few years back. Well, I won't say the airline, but you can probably all go look it up. His accident resulted in an AD, and he had another friend who sea-fitted a Beech 1900 in Alaska. They both got him involved in the CIRP program and changed his life, he says. Quick side note to the engine failure things. A couple months later, he had to go back to recurrent training. And he asked the sim instructor if he could please not give me a number 1 engine fire because I was still kind of having flashbacks, and we'll jump you about that. He gave it to me anyway, and it was actually kind of helpful in the end because it helped me get over the shock. The guy's actually at a major airline with me now. But let's be clear. I'm sorry to hear about your accident. It's not easy, and I know what you're going through. So I sympathize with you, and I'll shoot my available in April. Maybe we can grab up for a coffee. Anyway, off to JFK for me. Long night ahead. Well, Kyle, appreciate all that, and yeah, we got to get together and hang out one of these days. A big congratulations to Jared LaBarbera. I mentioned him a couple episodes back, but he finished up that instrument rating we were talking about, and just in time, too, because It's about to be marine layer season here in SoCal, and he was mentioned in episode 95. Matt Sparks, another friend of mine who probably needs to be on the show, but he said just a quick note. Bummer you lost some of the passion, but my guess is it's still down in there somewhere. You can't take away the deep inner boy just by giving the man crap to deal with on a daily basis. The inner boy is still the foundation. Bikes, cars, planes, the color red. I can pretend to be a grown-up, but given the choice, I'd still get a matching set. A Ferrari, a red Beach 350 King Air, and a red Dogma. Or a British Racing Green Aston, a Phenom, and a hand-built steel frame from the UK. We're talking about bikes, by the way. Anyway, then we actually came up with a couple more fun dream garage scenarios. Car, plane, bike. Yep, it's still down there somewhere. But yeah, he's a big aerobatics guy, and actually he has quite a few skills and likes to teach others the same. So good times. And hey, you know what, for all you out there, maybe I should share that. What's the ideal, you know how you do like a 3-car garage thing for cars? We could do the ideal live-in hangar, right? Airplane, car, other vehicle, bike, or whatever you want to do. But send me your thoughts for the ideal three vehicle hangar. All right, now for something special. Elliot Cox, he's a friend of the show, and he emailed something. He says, I couldn't think of a better way to knock the dust off the mic. Well done, BG. Kudos also to Rob for being the perfect partner for that storytelling adventure. I'm looking forward to hearing what comes next from podcasting on a plane, and I'll definitely add Rob's podcast to my already bursting podcast queue. Thanks for the shout out, and it's great to hear you back on the mic. Well, you know what? I appreciate that. And here's the thing. I'm sure those of you that are out there are like, wait, Elliot Cox. I know that name for some reason. And the reason you do is because, well, I've mentioned him here before. But one of the things he does is he writes. And he writes a lot. And he writes for Airfax. He's published in Plane and Pilot, just all over the place. So one of the things he said about the Talk to Tower episode, he sent me another email. Says, I would have definitely used Talk to Tower when I was working on my ratings. And I wish them as much success. This fantastic idea. Anyway, if you're interested in reading about my challenges on the radio, I have an article in the December 2021 issue of Plane and Pilot. Online here. There's a link. Shameless self-promotion over. Good to have you back on the mic. So, okay. I'm actually really glad that he sent me that. I don't mind shameless self-promotions because, if they're for something good that I can share, then party on, Wayne. So I went and I read it, and it's a really good article. Elliot's a great writer. And I was going to narrate it. So I emailed him. I said, hey, man, can I narrate your stuff? And I said, you know what? I got a better idea. Why don't you narrate your stuff? Because it's not often we get a good writer on here who's actually willing to share their content in an audio story. So he actually agreed. He put it together, I think while he was flying or in a layover somewhere. Anyway, I thought it'd be special to share it. So without any further ado, here is Elliot Cox sharing his story about getting over some stuff on the radio.
Ask any pilot what they struggled with most in their training, and I bet the majority will say the radio. My first 22 years in aviation were spent as a maintenance technician of one sort or another. I've been an avionics tech, A&P, IA, and director of maintenance. I've spent a lot of time taxiing jets around various sized airports, mostly GSO and CLT, so I felt pretty confident about my radio skills, until I started flying. I showed up for my first lesson in the mighty Aranca Champ early in February 2017. When my instructor and I talked about communication, I proudly declared that I was already familiar with using a radio, and I felt pretty good about it. My instructor hand-propped the airplane, got in the back seat, and ran through the typical pre-taxi procedure. He said, go ahead and let CTAF know we're taxiing to run up for 2-3. Let who know? CTAF, the common frequency. I wrote common frequency on my shiny new knee board and said, we're going where? The run-up area for runway 23. I wrote run-up 23 beside common frequency on my knee board, looked confidently down at the instrument panel, up out of the windshield, then expertly said, I don't know how to do any of that. Over the next several months, I learned what to say on frequency, when to say it, and, most importantly, when to shut up and listen. When I took the check ride for my private pilot certificate, I was, again, pretty confident with my abilities on the radio, until I started instrument training. I studied for my instrument rating, a lot. I listened to live ATC, a lot. I listened mostly to Daytona Beach Tower and Approach, because that's where Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University is based, and there are always plenty of students stammering on the radio just like I was. It was an invaluable resource, and I learned a lot. My instrument instructor used a great method of teaching radio independence. He was responsible for 100% of the radio communications at the beginning of my IFR journey, Gradually, and mostly undetected, I was handed more and more communication duties. He handed me the mic to request a practice approach here and an on-the-go report there. When it was time for my instrument check ride, I was handling the flying and the talking. As an aside, the two favorite quotes from my instructor, "Hey, Ron," during instrument training are, "When I didn't understand the approach clearance the controller issued to us, you talk fine on the radio, you just need to listen faster." And a slight tap on my shoulder, "It's a push-to-talk button, not a push-to-think button." Once I made it through my instrument training, I felt confident in my radio communications, until I started my commercial training. Well, that's not completely accurate. The commercial rating is often seen as a time-building rating, after which you're expected to understand laws, regulations, and generally be capable of getting yourself around every chunk of airspace that the United States has to offer. This rating puts the pro in commercial, or something like that. My friend Joe and I started working as avionics technicians together back in 2001 at the GSO Citation Service Center, and have remained close friends ever since. We began our flight training within a few days of each other, and we have a spirited attitude of competition between us. As Joe and I were building time for our commercial ratings, we challenged ourselves by flying into congested airspace on some days and playing ATC on approaches while the other was under the hood on others. When we flew together, it was fair game at any time to call out engine failures, fires, commando attacks, etc. Neither of us cut the other any slack, and we had an absolute blast doing it. I passed my commercial check ride. Then, shortly after, I passed my commercial multi-check ride. I felt confident in my radio communications in single and multi-engine airplanes at that point, until my first leg in the right seat of a jet. ATC talks differently to people in jets. When they talk to a piston single, most of the time they'll mirror the speed of the pilot's speech. I don't know if it's intentional, but it happens. The default cadence of ATC talking to a piston single is that of a concerned citizen helping an airplane cross a busy street. The default cadence of ATC talking to a jet is that of Niagara Falls helping you into the water. The patient gentleman, Matt, with whom I was flying my first day in a jet, walked me through how to get us out of a non-towered airport and on the way home with our passengers. Here's the frequency for clearance delivery. If you can't get them on frequency, give them a call at this phone number. Tell them you want to hold for release clearance. They'll give you the clearance just like they do at home, then we'll call them up when we're ready to go. On the leg home, I was caught off guard completely when the center controller gave me 3, the maximum, instructions while we were still almost 200 nautical miles from home. It went something like this. Citation 7 Echo Charlie, contact Atlanta Center 132.35. I read back the instruction and went over to Atlanta. I wasn't expecting anything more than a regular check-in. Atlanta, Citation 7 Echo Charlie, flight level 370. Citation 7 Echo Charlie, descend and maintain flight level 240, published speeds of flag, descend via the stock car 3 arrival, landing south. I got as far as pressing the direct button on the FMS before forgetting every English word I'd ever learned. It must have been the blank stare on my dumb face that clued the PIC into the fact that I was stuck in an endless loop of stuckness. He keyed up the mic and read back, descend and maintain flight level 240, published speeds of flag, descend via the stock car 3, landing south, 7 Echo Charlie. I'm not saying my instrument instructor didn't prepare me for STARS, standard terminal arrival routes, because he did. The problem is that piston airplanes typically don't fly arrivals, and it's very difficult to teach someone how to fly an arrival without being able to demonstrate it properly. STARS for piston airplanes are usually not more than a heading and a fix, which works just fine, but the complexity of arrivals applicable to jets is something that is fairly difficult, if not impossible, to teach at 0 feet AGL and 1G. I apologized to the PIC for words not coming out of my face, and he graciously let me off the hook before showing me how to set up the arrival in the FMS. We landed uneventfully, and my first 1.8 hours of turbine time was complete. To quote Gary, my aviation hype man, I was so far behind the airplane that after we took off, I looked back and saw myself walking out of the FBO. I'm a tactile learner, so, much like learning how stars work, I can't grasp a concept until I've been neck deep in it. If I learn a lesson the hard way and it hurts, it tends to stick. The more it hurts, the better it sticks. After that first flight, I studied the star charts quite a bit more while I was listening to live ATC. Hearing the same thing over and over again said the same way is also very helpful to me. I've flown about 250 hours in jets now, plus another 70 hours in level D sims, and I think I'm just starting to get to the point where I'm learning how to communicate on a professional level. I still get the occasional instruction with which I'm not familiar, where my more experienced mentor has to help me a bit, but those cries for help are becoming fewer and further between. As I asked for advice from experienced pilots and controllers on how to do words good, the vast majority have said some version of, if you ever get confused, flustered, or overwhelmed by ATC, fess up. Quickly. The absolute worst case scenario is that you'll hear an irritation in the controller's voice as they begrudgingly give you simpler instructions at a slower pace. Far more often, you'll hear empathy in the controller's voice as they happily give you simpler instructions at a slower pace. We can't always sound like Chuck Yeager on the radio, and we have to keep in mind that controllers didn't start off sounding like Houston mission controllers either. Sometimes it's tough to remember that the sound coming out of the headset is just a person doing their best to keep airplanes from fusing together. As an experiment, one of these days, I'm going to check in with Center. Good afternoon, Falcon 7 Echo Charlie, student pilot, flight level 410, just to see if I get a reaction. Better yet, Center. Good afternoon, Falcon 7 Echo Charlie, maintenance, flight level 410. That should get a rise, or at least a pause.
Cool, huh? By the way, I love audio feedback, and I used to get a lot of them. I haven't had so many lately, but if you want to send something in, you can get over your mic fright too and record me something on your smartphone and send it in. Love to have it on the show. So anyway, Elliot, thank you. It's a really well-written article. Again, December 2021 issue of Plane and Pilot. You want to go read it for yourself? Cool, but hey, you've already heard it, right? Anyway, as promised, I have an interview for you today from Dave Moser from Cirrus, and it's about their new deal with the United Aviate Academy to provide aircraft for that, and one of our own homegrown ab initio programs in the U.S. So, without further ado, here's my interview with Dave Moser. David Moser, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks, Brandon. I'm pleased to be here. It's good to start the week talking about airplanes.
Always is. Now, I get emails from time to time from, people's PR and from companies about, hey, can we come on your show? Can we talk about a new book? We have a new product out. You want to talk about it? And a lot of those I'm sort of like, yeah, no, not really. But in this case, I got an email from Cirrus about a new tie-up between, the manufacturer Cirrus and the aviation industry that it kind of struck my fancy because I think that more than just a business deal, this is something that's really going to affect the industry in a big way, and that's going to be the meat of what we talk about today. But, for everybody who's here who hasn't heard of you, David, what is your position at Cirrus?
I am the Vice President of Fleet and Special Mission Aircraft Sales for Cirrus. So with that, I'm responsible for all of our institutional sales. That's sales to large flight academies, government and military customers, as well as the air charter market.
Neat. Before we move on, I got to ask, the military, they're using Cirrus products?
Yeah, we've got a few different military accounts that are using our airplanes for flight training or various light transportation missions. The most notable one here in the United States is the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs is flying the SR-20s, which they note as the T-53A, but it's a modified version of the SR-20 that they use for their powered flight program.
Well, that's pretty neat. All right, so David, I know you're probably all over the place, but where are you right now? Tell me about your surroundings. Where are you in the world?
I'm in the Denver, Colorado area. Actually, Golden, Colorado is my home base, but you're right. I cover the globe, and so it's actually a little bit unusual that I'm in my home office today in Colorado.
Well, I appreciate you taking all your home office time to spend with us. I actually grew up in Colorado. I learned to fly in Telluride.
Ah, that's a cool place.
Yeah, I love Colorado. All right, well, you sound like you get to do a lot of really amazing stuff. And as a former aircraft salesman myself, I know that there are often pretty neat opportunities that come up. But I was hoping maybe you could share something really, really unique that you've been able to do with your position.
Well, I've traveled the globe. That last count, I think it's been 35 or 40 countries that I've done business in with Cirrus, and I've been with Cirrus for about 8 years. We've done some amazing opportunities with major airlines from Lufthansa, Emirates, and now United, as well as many university programs. A number of new programs here in the U.S., Marshall University, Southern Utah University, as well as some established programs like Oklahoma State University and Most recently, Kansas State University picked up some Cirrus aircrafts for their programs. And then, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, there's been some interesting military opportunities that we've worked here in the U.S., in France, Saudi Arabia, and in Chile.
All right, well, I'm going to ask you a question here, and it's going to be a little bit of a minefield for you. So I hope you can appreciate it. But why do you think that? I mean, as you speak, I'm sitting here thinking that there are a lot of places moving towards Cirrus and maybe more away from the traditional manufacturers that they've used for literally decades now. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lot of good airplanes for flight training, but what we've seen in recent years is the advancements in technology for general aviation aircraft have adapted them well for professional pilot training, and I think there's really three reasons for that. Um, with the Cirrus, first, safety. We have one of the best safety records in the industry, and the embedded safety equipment on the airplane, from our electronic stability protection and stall protection to the Cirrus airframe parachute system caps, um, is a pretty unique safety feature, and I think that sets us apart from the rest of the industry. But there's more to it. I think there's many other advanced technologies in the airplane. The modern aerodynamic airframe improves performance and comfort, and then the Perspective Plus avionics system that we use from Garmin has some pretty unique features as well. It's got a full flight management system with a QWERTY keyboard. So that's very kind of representative of the kind of systems that you have in larger transport category jets. Um, and then the automation systems are pretty robust as well. You've got a full automated control system, and the hazard avoidance systems that are in the airplane to include traffic, terrain, and the onboard weather systems. All contribute to um, the ability to train in an aircraft that's going to be very representative of what the students will be flying in their careers. And then finally, what we call Cirrus approach, which is both as it says, an approach and a philosophy towards standardized training. So Cirrus promotes a way of training in our airplane that I think is pretty unique in the industry, and we provide courseware with a lot of rich video content and tools that are available for our customers to use and incorporate into their professional pilot training curriculums.
Sure. Well, all that stuff is wonderful, and any time I've ever had an opportunity to fly a Cirrus, I've definitely gone for it and enjoyed every minute of it. You know, this show reaches a really wide range of aviation types and age groups as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit to the people who believe that might be kind of a lot of tech overload for a beginning pilot, like for a student pilot to have all of that neat equipment, which we all love. But at the same time, it kind of seems like a lot of buttons, a lot of heads down, a lot of playing with screens, and not a whole lot of aviating. So maybe you could talk to that point a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. No. The SR series aircraft, or the track aircraft, that's our flight training version of the SR airplanes, are well equipped for both primary flight training, and then more advanced training as you get into instrument and commercial work. But you can introduce that technology that we talked about in phases. So you can turn the MFD functions off, and just put your engine indications up on the multifunction display, and then begin introducing additional technologies into the training, as the students get the fundamentals of flying the aircraft down.
Sure. Actually, I didn't know that. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit more. When I first started instructing in G1000 equipped aircraft, when that kind of became the industry standard in the early to mid 2000s, one of those products that somebody came out with early on was those little stick-on instrument covers, and it was basically just a giant blacked-out red X that looked like what happens when your AHRS fails or something. You could slap that over it, but there wasn't a way to selectively turn off some of those functions. You're saying now there is?
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is that on the multi-function display that we normally fly with a moving map or the ability to look at traffic or weather. You can turn those things off so that you're just looking at instrument or engine instrumentation, much like you would in a legacy airplane. So on your primary flight display, you'd have all your primary flight instruments, attitude indicator, direction, altitude, airspeed, those kinds of indications, and then engine instrumentation on your right screen or your multifunction display. And then then you can introduce the moving maps, you can introduce hazard avoidance, and the depth of capabilities that those features provide.
All right. One thing you touched on there was the Track 20 and the Track aircraft, and I did a little research on that, and what I found, and I'm going to quote this out of, I think it was simpleflying.com, the article I read, but it said the long-running line offers increased room for students and instructors in the cabin and is 9 knots faster than the previous generation. So what technical changes to a regular SR-20, for instance, are in a Track 20?
Yeah, I think some of those references might have related to this year's uh, model of the aircraft, where they did a little bit of streamlining of the aircraft to squeeze a couple of extra knots out of the airplane. But the real difference between the Track and the standard SR series is some minor modifications, but meant to suit a high utilization training environment. So to give you an example of that, with our retail airplanes, you can get some very luxurious leather upholstery, fancy paint jobs, and a lot goes into the aesthetics of the airplane. With the Track, we use a material for the seat covers and other parts of the aircraft that you touch, including the throttle handle and the yoke, that is designed for high wear, for when you have multiple students flying multiple missions each day in the aircraft, and sometimes 1,000 hours or more per year in each aircraft. Traditional materials might not wear as well as what we've designed for the Track airplane.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Anything you can wipe the sweat off a little more easily is probably a good idea, huh?
Exactly. And then we've introduced a couple other cool features into the Track for flight training. One of them is a landing gear simulator. So it's an option, and that many of our customers who are doing flight training take for the airplane. It's a simulated landing gear system. So you've got a landing gear handle, and you've got a electronic control panel for the flight instructor, who can induce various faults into the system. So if you're teaching students who are going to go on to fly more advanced aircraft with retractable landing gear, you're able to introduce that into their flows and checklist, thereby allowing students to uh, go through abnormal and emergency checklists as if they were flying an airplane with retractable landing gear that might have some type of fault.
That's great. Yeah, that's kind of the hardest part is now that since a lot of that stuff doesn't have to be done in a complex aircraft any longer, trying to get students that experience with retractable gear and all the other stuff early on is great. Okay, so speaking of training with faults and sweating in an airplane, the real reason you're here today is because we wanted to talk about a recent tie-up deal that you guys have with United's Aviate Academy, which, if I remember correctly, is Westwind and Goodyear. But the ab initio program that United has to get people started from zero time up through working into one of the regionals and ultimately into United. They talk a lot about pilot shortage, the pilot shortage. They throw out numbers such as they need 10,000 pilots over the next, I think, decade. We can do the math there. It's about 1,000 a year. I've heard a lot of numbers thrown out there, but it's serious, at least according to them. And one of the ways they've decided to tackle that is by training people just from the absolute beginning up into working for United. So you now at Cirrus and you now in your position have a special role in making that happen.
Yeah, that's right. So, recently United bought Westwind, which is a flight academy in the Phoenix area, and they've rebranded that now as the United Aviate Academy, and it's pretty unique in the sense that that United is the first major airline in the United States to stand up an ab initio flight training academy, meaning they're bringing students in with zero time, no flight experience, and training them to be professional airline pilots. They'll flow through the United Aviate Academy into a regional airline and ultimately into the United mainline system. And as you said, the numbers are big. There's a need to recruit up to 10,000 pilots in the next decade for United, and about half of those should come through the United Aviate Academy in Goodyear. And there's a particular focus that United has on diversity. In order to address the global pilot shortage, they need to bring more people into aviation, and so they're doing that by heavily recruiting from populations that have been underrepresented in the airline industry. So that can be women or people of color, and they expect that half the people coming through the academy will fit that profile. So, we're really excited at Cirrus to be part of that mission, and be able to provide the airplanes that those students will be flying at the Aviate Academy.
Sure. Now, are those the Track 20 airplanes?
They are, yeah. The initial order is for 25 Track 20 airplanes, and they've got purchase rights for an additional 50. And at the rate that they're growing, the expectation is that they'll take all of those.
Well, those are big expectations, and I mean, Cirrus, I guess, is ready to meet that demand. I guess the factory's really churning them out.
Yeah, our production has increased significantly. Our demand, both on the retail side and the fleet side of our business, it has gone up considerably over the last few years. But we are increasing production in order to meet that demand.
Well, I guess the biggest question I have about this whole thing is if I'm going to be training in an airplane in Goodyear, Arizona in August, does a Track 20 have an air conditioner?
It does, yeah. It's optional equipment, but United did order air conditioners on all of those airplanes.
Man, I want to send an extra special thank you to everyone who sent in something for me to share today. I really appreciate your thoughts and your involvement in this show. And it gives extra meaning when I say podcasting on a plane is 100% listener supported, and I'd love to keep it that way. If you have the means and you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. You get episodes early and sometimes other fun stuff too. So if you want to be a supporter, head over to podcastingonaplane.com, click on support the show, and pick whatever you feel is right. If you're not into that recurring thing, I get it. It's a PayPal link there for whatever you feel is right. Or if you want to be like Lyman Howard, who went over to buymeacoffee.com/PravalGolf, he bought me 5 coffees. And that's not the first time. Lyman, you're the man. Thank you. He wrote a nice email too. Anyway, Brandon at podcastingonaplane.com is the place to send your thoughts. You can also use your smartphone SpeakPipe widget that pops up when you visit podcastingonaplane.com and record me something, and it might end up on the show. But as always, I thank you so much for your support and your feedback in whatever form it takes, and for listening to the show and passing the word along about this or any of your favorite aviation podcasts to a friend. That's all for now. If frequency change is approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content, and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his, and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie, and fun, but is in no way, shape, or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.